Okay, so welcome very much to this month's in-service. We're doing inclusion in the classroom, language and tips on gender, sexual identities, and disabilities. I'm very, very happy and proud to introduce Stephanie Middleman. Stephanie Middleman has been a part-time faculty at Concordia University in Montreal since 2005 in the Department of Applied Human Sciences. She teaches courses on human sexuality, diversity and human relations, and family life education. She is also a member of the Order of Sexologists of Quebec, an ASECT certified sexuality educator, and a certified family life educator with the National Council of Family Relations. In addition, Stephanie trains schools, boards, organizations, and therapists across North America on working with individuals with diverse needs and has written and published several resources. And finally, Stephanie also sees clients in her private practice working with individuals with autism on issues of gender, sexuality, safety, and healthy relationships. So thank you so much for joining us, Stephanie, and bringing your knowledge to us.
Thank you, Sharona. I'm really pleased and excited to be here with all of you today. Before we begin, thank you to CIP for the invitation to be with your group this afternoon. And thank you personally to Sharona, who invited me in and helped organize this. And it's never easy to get everyone in the same place and organize these kinds of events. So thank you for that. We have a full agenda for the next hour, and it's a topic that we could probably spend several hours discussing. But there are some highlights that I would like to share with you. And then we're going to aim to leave a few minutes at the end where we can have discussion or ask questions. And then following that, Sharon is also going to send some additional information as well as a copy of the presentation as well. So folks are going to walk away with more information. Feel free to take notes now, but you're also going to get a bunch more following this. So don't feel like if you miss something, this is the last opportunity. So before we jump in, I would just like to issue what we call, a disclaimer or a trigger warning. And that is that we're talking about a sensitive subject today. Some of the words in this workshop may be hard for some folks to hear. Some may be, uncomfortable or feel triggering for some people. If you feel uncomfortable, please feel free to either send myself or Sharona is going to be managing the chat. Feel free to send a message to one of us, although she's more likely to see it before I do. For those who are not familiar with Zoom, you can either send a message to everyone, or you can, in the drop-down, find the person's name and send them a private message. So if you want to do that, feel free to send questions or any thoughts that way. You're also welcome to take a breath if you need, take a break, get up, stand up, walk around, do what you need to do. But be aware that we're going to talk about some things today that might be subjects that some folks have been talking about for a long time. And they also might be for other folks really new topics, right? And really new words and things that, perhaps we don't talk a lot about. So with that being said, I also want to keep in mind for people, or I'd like people to keep in mind that there are generational differences across many things, but certainly when we're talking about language, right? And the older I get, the more I notice that myself, right? In my own practice, in my own classroom. I started teaching, this is my 21st year at the university. So I now have seen a few generations. I also have helped raise two children in their mid and late 20s, and I have one teenager at home. And the language is different. the kinds of words that we use, the language is different across the generations. So one thing that I want us just to keep in mind is that some of these words might be something that, some folks here grew up with, and some of these words and concepts might be really new for others. So we're all going to learn together, but we also need to exert some understanding that we all didn't arrive at the same place, right, with this language, and that, there's been a lot of social change that has happened, particularly in the last 10 years, and especially around issues of gender and sexual identities. In fact, it's the only lecture that I consistently update not even every year, every semester. I'm updating this talk around language and this talk around gender and how we're talking about gender, because so much of the terminology is changing so quickly. So there may be, again, some words that people are not familiar with, and feel free to put that in the chat and we can go over them. And for others, this is just a way of life, right? This is just the way that we speak of these things. There are also, however, cultural differences to be aware of. And coming from different cultures, there's lots of different experiences here, different points of view. Not everybody feels the same way about how words are used and language is used. So we're going to talk about what best practice is right now, right? And if we were to do this talk again, maybe in a year, some things might shift. There might be new words, but what is best practice now? And how do we honor and respect our students as well as the colleagues and our team members around us, right? So let's talk about how we, best do that. The first thing to be aware of is that when we're talking about any sort of, gender or sexual identities, or we're talking about disabilities, any sort of really identity, we want to think about whether or not we are talking about person first, right, or identity first language, right? So a person first language statement might be, where we put the person before the disability in this case, for example. So we might talk about a person with autism. Okay, so we've often, referred to people, with an autism spectrum, disorder, if we're using autism as an example, as opposed to identity first would be an autistic person, right? Where we're putting the identity, in this case, we're talking about autism, where we're putting that first. What's important is that some people prefer person first language and some people prefer identity first language. And in the cases where we don't know, it's generally good practice, right, to use person first language. Okay, generally, if somebody says, you know what, no, I identify as an autistic individual, right, and they give that example, then you can, if they've said this, okay, you can be comfortable using that as well. However, if you're not sure, or you're not the one with the lived experience, typically the fallback is the person first language, meaning so a person, with autism, if we're using that example. Now, also going on to more about language, I'm not sure how many folks, and I can't see many of you, I can only see 4 or 5 of you on my little screen to the side, but how many people have ever heard this term, heteronormative? And heteronormative is actually a fairly recently coined term. It was actually coined in the early 90s. So perhaps some folks, have never heard this term before, but it really depicts an understanding much like it sounds. So hetero means heterosexual, and normative meaning that's the normal, or that's the assumed or implied normal. So heteronormativity is the assumption that heterosexuality, or the identity of being hetero, is the normal or the default or the standard or the correct, even some people would say the correct way, or correct sexual orientation or identity. We're going to put correct in quotations there, right? But that's what the term heteronormative means. It assumes that all people are naturally, right, heterosexual, and that heterosexual is the ideal, form of sexual expression or sexual identity. And in fact, to some extent, heteronormativity might be seen as superior to other forms or other identities. And when we start talking about one is better than the other, we start getting into the isms, right? So that's where we get into heterosexism. Okay, not that different than sexism, a belief that one sex is stronger or better than another. Heterosexism implies that one identity is better than another. Okay, our culture has a lot of heteronormative terms and language in it. It certainly is embedded in a lot of hetero sexism, and we see this throughout our institutions, our healthcare systems, education, and so on. One thing to really be aware here is that heteronormative words and language really minimize the queer experience. And some people might be familiar with that word queer, and other people, that might be new. What I mean by queer is sort of a catch-all in this context. People might argue it differently, but it's an umbrella term to mean outside of the heterosexual experience or identity at this point. So let's take a look at what some heteronormative words might actually be. And I think some people might not necessarily realize that, we often in everyday language use words, some of which are really inclusive and inviting to others, and some which kind of push people away and make them feel excluded or make them feel outside or less than. So, in the vein of this talk, we really want to, peel back the layers of how do we make people feel safe and included in our groups and honor and respect people's identities and our students and our colleagues. And sometimes we're using words that we're not even aware of, right? That may not be doing that. So what are some examples of, heteronormative language, keeping in mind that heteronormativity is the assumption, right, that straightness is the default. Okay. So even a term such as, and there's many that we can explore here, but the term virginity, right, or the term of losing your virginity, it's a very interesting, construct of ideas here. It's definitely socially constructed, and it's very much based in these gender narratives where boys or those with penises play one role and those with vaginas. So I'm not going to get into boys and girls. I'm just going to get into those with penises and those with vaginas have very sort of scripted roles and rules. But losing your virginity often implies that we're talking about penetration of a penis into a vagina or the vagina enveloping the penis, however you want to see it. Right? You can see it which in either direction. But that is the concept of losing virginity, right? And it's very much rooted in the hetero experience, right? So there are a lot of people who have been engaging in sexual experiences with others, and it may not involve a penis, or it may not involve a vagina, or it may not involve penetration, right? There's a huge range of sexual experiences that could be happening here. And we have so narrowly defined, we as a culture, society, losing your virginity in one way, right? So that's what we mean by heteronormative kind of language. There are lots of folks that have been having lots of different sex for many years, right? And it may not involve penetration, it may not involve a penis, it may not, involve a vagina, or it may not involve penis and a vagina. Okay. Other words also assume relationships. So when we look at words like wife or husband or girlfriend or boyfriend, right, these are very commonly used terms, but we are assuming, making an assumption that somebody is with someone of the opposite sex. So, for example, I can come out to you and share with you that I identify as a cis female. And so I was born with body parts that match essentially or line up, if you will, with the way that I see myself. And if I tell someone that I'm married, they will usually make the assumption that I'm married to somebody who identifies as male. Okay, that's what we mean by heteronormativity, right? It rarely, if ever, comes up the idea that I could be married to somebody who, for example, identifies as female, right? Or who identifies as non-binary, or who identifies as trans, right? So we know that the laws around marriage are not the same everywhere, but even asking someone, if they're married or what their husband's name is, right, is an assumption of someone's relationship and someone's gender. Okay, so when we're talking to people in groups or in our practices or in an educational setting or in some sort of colleague situation, it's really important for us not to make assumptions about other people, right? About the gender that they identify as, about their interest to be in relationships or not, about their interest to be in relationships with who, right? And the gender that they're with. And if there's a reason to ask someone if they're with someone, we can do that in a way that is not gendered, right? So if I need to ask somebody if they're with someone or they're engaging in sexual behaviors, right? The question is, are you engaging in sexual behaviors? right? I don't really need to know the gender of the other person. I don't need to know their identity. I also want to throw one other thing in, which is that behavior doesn't necessarily equal identity. And that one's a little tricky sometimes for folks. But sometimes people might engage in behaviors with somebody of the same gender, somebody who is non-binary, for example, but they don't necessarily identify, right, as gay or lesbian or bi or pan, right? They may not. So those two things don't always line up. And we make a ton of assumptions and we get it wrong a lot of the times. We meaning society, right? In the same way that a lot of times, and this is, gender is very different than sexual identities. Gender is how you see yourself, and sexual identities is who you are attracted to or sexually interested in. But a lot of times folks will present in ways that are not necessarily to someone's expectations, right? As either, very feminine or very masculine. And that doesn't mean that their identity is either how they are presenting, right? So there are big ranges there, and there is some fluidity. So the bottom line is that we really have to be careful of our own assumptions, right? And I'm going to challenge folks to just catch yourself making assumptions. Next time you make an assumption about what somebody's identity might be based on the way that they're presenting, right? Just ask yourself, well, did I just make an assumption there? Right? Or next time, we hear people say this all the time, that they can tell if somebody's straight or gay or bisexual, right? Just make an assumption. Sorry, catch yourself making the assumption is what I wanted to say. Just bring awareness to whether or not you have that assumption going on in your mind and what might be feeding that, right? I think awareness is the first step towards making changes, but I think that when we bring awareness to these kinds of things, we begin to see that where we thought we were right all the time, we may not be, right? So that's really where it begins. Now, let's move into a little bit more around language and some examples of language that can be outdated, particularly around gender. So I said at the beginning of this that there's really been a shift that has happened in the last 10 years, particularly around language and the way that we use words. And there are some words that really bring people in, and some words that kind of keep people out, right? So here are some examples of language in the realm of gender. I will look at sexual identity and disability as well, of language that we really just don't use anymore, right? In the sense that, and this one might be a little bit tricky for folks to start with, but calling someone a man or a woman is really simplifying the complexities of gender and sex, right? So, as defined here, sex really refers to biology. Gender refers to the way in which we relate to or understand or identify with that biology. And so when we talk about cis or CIS folks, we're talking about folks whose body parts or the parts that they are born with at birth do align with their sense of gender identity. But that is not the case for everyone, right? And for some folks, that's really early on in life, and for some folks, that's later in life. What we say, instead of just calling people a man or a woman, we say instead assigned male or assigned female at birth, because the terms man and woman are socially constructed, right? What's a man? What's a woman? Right? What we're really meaning here is assigned male and female at birth. If folks have questions on these kinds of points, I'm very happy to answer them. We can discuss them afterwards. Feel free to send them to Sharona in a text. Okay, but now other words that often come up are words that are gendered, which look something like fireman, policeman, mailman, stewardess, right? These are lots of words that we still hear that really are quite outdated in today's, use of language. We say instead firefighter, right? Which is gender neutral and inclusive. We say police officer. We say mail carrier or flight attendant, right? So these are not dependent on someone's gender. And I'm sure there's a lot more we can list there as well. But again, I want us to be aware that there are lots of folks here that grew up with terminology of firemen and policemen, right? And change sometimes takes time, right? Sometimes it certainly does take time. But the point of developing new habits here, right, and switching over to something like firefighter and police officer is so that we are being inclusive, right, of everyone. We're not leaving out people with this gendered, sort of way of saying things. And there are other terms as well in the realm of gender that are really outdated at this point, don't even roll off my tongue easily, are often considered hate speech, especially in the context in which they might be used. Words like tranny and dyke, hermaphrodite, she-male, those are really terms that are outdated and have very rich histories of being offensive and even violent words, at times, and are really, in some circumstances, considered hate speech, so should never, ever be used. But we do hear people use these words sometimes, and sometimes people are aware that they're offensive, and sometimes they're not, right? But the great majority of folks will find offense in these terms. And now going back to this last example about gender, if we want to talk about husbands and wives, or we want to talk about husbands and husbands, or wives, or girlfriends and boyfriends, and so on, we can talk about partners, right? We can talk about married couples. We can talk about spouses. I know there are different younger terms too, like boo or bae. I'm not cool enough, right? But there are definitely younger terms that are gender neutral. That's the point. Go with what works for you, but they're all inclusive terms. Okay, this is one that I definitely want to share with folks because I see it all the time. And I see it in presentations, I see it in everyday conversation, I see it in emails, this kind of thing, is when we address a group or a crowd as guys. And it looks something like, okay, guys, let's get going. Okay, guys, we're ready to go. Or, okay, guys, let's, jump in. And it's interesting because I think the term guys was used at some point really as a catch-all to bring everyone in, right? It really was designed to be, I think it started to be something that was meant to include everyone. But over time, right, this is not how it is experienced. And lots of people have come forward to say, you know what, I don't really identify with guy, which is very sort of male oriented. It's referring to, to males, and or dudes would be another, term that's often used. And so the term guys or you guys is something that can feel like some people are being left out. This one was a hard one for me to change, admittedly, because I had been teaching for almost 20 years, right? Um, when I really started to think about this term, and I certainly did start most of my groups like that, what I did was I asked a student of mine what term might be more inclusive. And they told me at that point that they really liked the term folks, right? That it seemed to be something that really caught, cast the widest net in terms of making most people feel comfortable, that they had never felt uncomfortable with that term. So I started to try that out, and I've had really good success with it so far. I've never had anyone tell me that that doesn't feel right for them, but certainly I would be open to that if someone did. And it took a little bit of tweaking at first for me to go from guys to folks, right? I had to stop myself and catch myself and change it. It took probably about 3 or 4 times of starting groups, and now it's rather awkward to say the word guys, right? And I'm just much more used to using the word folks. Okay, so we want to make sure that we are including a diversity of identities. We could say things like folks, you all, everyone. I had a colleague of mine start a group once, which I thought was quite interesting and a little comical. I don't know if it caught everyone, but it worked in that moment. It was guys, gals, and non-binary pals. guys, gals, and non-binary pals. So it seemed to have worked in that moment. But again, I think, a better way to go would just be folks or everyone, just to be aware that not everybody relates to guys, right? We could say participants, students, friends, and so on, right? How is everyone doing today? Good afternoon, folks. It's great to see, all of you. So these are little changes, that we could make along the way. And we may not be aware of the impact that these kinds of things have on other people. Sometimes we only hear the negative feedback and maybe not necessarily the positive. Um, but the great majority of people that have gone through childhood or adolescence feeling different in some way or gender diverse in some way will tell you that there were maybe one or two teachers, right, or leaders in their community that made them feel really comfortable, right, that made them feel really safe. They often have, if they're lucky, it's more than that, right? But we want to strive for at least some spaces where people are feeling, safe. I'd like to see, where everyone is feeling safe everywhere. But what you hear are very special stories of individuals. And so I'm sharing this with you because sometimes we have an impact on people's lives in ways that we're not always aware. And just changing our language a little bit, right, can feel really good for a lot of people. Okay, now we also may have some folks that may be transitioning, that may be gender variant. So this is a very big topic and one that brings up a little bit of confusion for people. So if there are questions, I'm happy to answer them. But we have folks that identify as non-binary. We have folks that also identify as trans. Those are not exactly the same, in terms of definitions. There's some difference there. Some people would argue that it's under the same umbrella. Some people would argue that it's different. But there are some folks who may transition, and transitioning means a variety of steps that one might take, right, to affirm their gender. Right. So their gender is the way in which they see themselves and they identify. So there may be some steps that people do to affirm their gender and the way they see themselves. And some of those steps might include internal, right? The way that we think about ourselves. Some of those steps might include social, right? And social might include things like pronouns or names that people call us. Some of those steps might include legal documents, or sort of, more down the line. And then there could be physical changes as well, medical as well as non-medical. Non-medical might be things like clothing and haircuts, right? Or hair removal. And then medical will be more like procedures. What I want to point out here is the use of language that has shifted. So we no longer use terminology like sex change or sex reassignment surgery. Okay, these are actually pretty abrasive terms that don't land well with those in the trans community. It just feels antiquated, it feels old, it doesn't feel representative of what the experience is. So what we say today, and most of these words, by the way, have come from people in these communities, which is why these are grassroots movements. It's so important that we're taking our cues from people in communities, right? These are not, being made up outside of the community. We're speaking to folks, both in the 2S LGBTQI community, as well as the disability community. Today, instead of sex change or sex reassignment surgery, leave those terms at the door. They don't land well with most people. We say instead transition or transitioning, right? Or is transitioning referring to, a series of steps, or gender affirming care, or gender affirming medical care, gender affirming procedures or treatments. But the idea here is gender affirming meaning righting a wrong, right? Something wasn't right to begin with, right? We're not changing something, we're righting a wrong, okay? And language is powerful. Language is really, important for people. in terms of showing acceptance, or making people feel diminished in some way or leaving them out. Now, for people who are not familiar with the term dead name is a name that someone may have been assigned at birth that they no longer use or only use in some circumstances, right? Defined by that individual. Dead names is a very sensitive and private name for a lot of folks. And we really should not be asking people or forcing someone to disclose that without, well, asking them for permission first, because many people choose a new name to live by, and the name that they were given at birth is no longer in use or referred to as a dead name. Okay, so being aware of this, that this is one of those changes that we're talking about above with transitioning, that we have to respect that somebody may have had another name that was assigned at birth that's no longer in use. Okay, the other term too that I wanted to just point out here when we're talking about transitioning is the term gender euphoria. Euphoria is excitement and happiness, right? And what this means in this context is when somebody is comfortable and excited by their gender. So let's move on to a few more examples of terms that are no longer with us or no longer in use, or maybe one day will be no longer at all in circulation. They're still around a little bit, but they don't land well, right? They're outdated terms and so on. So around sexual identities, the term or the phrases of "that's so gay," right? I know we've heard this. It's very difficult to walk in a high school classroom or hallway without hearing this. It still continues to be very problematic to use the term gay in the way of an insult, right? It should just never be used. And I really wanted to put, I think most people understand that, but I really wanted to put it up here because all of you are educators, and I think it's important to note that if you see this happening and you see somebody, calling someone gay, or the shirt they're wearing is gay, or whatever it is, the word gay being used as an insult, I'm going to ask people to intervene. I'm going to challenge you to intervene, because when students see that this happens in front of staff or faculty and nobody says anything, there's a sense of acceptance and compliance there, right? It becomes almost like okay to do, like we're going to turn a blind eye to this. And interestingly, blind eye is actually on one of our slides, so I'm going to take that back and I'm going to correct myself. We turn away from the problem, right? And I'm asking folks not to turn away from the problem because it really makes other people really uncomfortable. And there may be some people who are not in a position or feel like in a position of power to be able to say something. Some other words that are outdated include terms like lifestyle and sexual preference. There was a time when, folks from the 2S LGBTQI community may have been referred to as, this is a preference, right? Meaning that you can change it on a dime if you wanted to. This is just a lifestyle, right? It's a lifestyle choice, similar or akin to, I decide to go to the gym every day, right? That's a lifestyle change or choice. It's certainly, identities don't work that way, and it's really minimizing to use these terms. And that's why we don't use these terms anymore. The terms that are used today are sexual orientation or identity. Those two terms are used equally, and at this point mean the same thing. Okay, so now that we've looked at some terms and some words of what not to say, let's take a look at, we're going to look at two things next. We're going to look at some tips to be more inclusive in our classrooms, but I also want to just stop for a minute and talk about, what do we do when we misgender? What do we do when we make a faux pas or we make a mistake? Because we are human and we do make mistakes, right? So it could be uncomfortable to make a mistake. So I wanted to take the time to run through some ideas here. So we all have social responsibility, and this is the last one here, to remember basic human respect. Okay. And there are more and more people who are coming forward and saying, I prefer, or I want, or these are my pronouns. This is how I identify. Okay. What's going to happen is sometimes people don't know someone's identity or somebody's pronoun, and there may be a mistake. Right. Now, most of the time when a mistake happens, it's because somebody didn't know. Right. The great majority of people are not running around trying to hurt one another and offend one another. Now, that doesn't minimize or take away from the fact that there are some people who are less respectful, right, than we would like. There are some people who are trying to hurt other people, right? I would never minimize that. But the great majority of folks, when they make a social faux pas, they didn't know, right? Or they make a blunder, or they make, misgender. I will also say it becomes a little bit more confusing too for folks who are black and white thinkers, because we're telling people that gender is not a binary black and white thing, which is what a lot of people grew up believing. Gender's a spectrum, right? And so there aren't two options. And so people who are more concrete thinkers have a harder time with this. People with social communication or social difficulties have a harder time with this, sort of getting their head around it in some ways. And so I know, everyone here works with folks who are neurodiverse. There's actually, we're going to look at the intersectionality shortly coming up between gender and ASD, and there's a higher fluidity and crossover there, which is really interesting, right? Really interesting. So more and more research coming out. Nobody really has an understanding of why just yet, but we do see that it is there. But still, sometimes people might have more difficulty in others, right? Or because the nature of social communication disorders is to think more in terms of black and white. So that could be something that you do see. And we want to teach people what they should do if they misgender, right? So the first thing to do is, if you get it wrong on any level, meaning you identify gender to someone and it's wrong, or you use, the wrong pronoun, the first thing to do is apologize. Okay, so it does nothing if you walk away and ignore it. It makes it worse. It's literally throwing fuel onto whatever little mini fire was, set already. What you want to do is apologize, and that's what extinguishes it. So you want to own it, and the apology should be sincere, right? Like, I'm really sorry, not an angry, you're making me do this kind of apology. So a sincere apology, and also a statement about how trying harder next time is really important, right? And that can be something basic like, I'm really sorry, I'm going to try to do better next time. I think that I just modeled that for you 2 minutes ago, where I corrected course because I've used an old expression that just came out in this conversation, and it's actually something on the slides coming up that we're shifting away from using, right? And so we want to shift and own that and apologize, and then try to do better. Keep the apology brief, so that it's not about you. If somebody goes, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I called you a girl, but you really look like a girl, but you're a guy, but I don't know, you really look like a girl. And then you're going on and on and on, right? You're really making it about you. Right? If you've misgendered someone, try not to offend them more. In other words, it's probably not the first time they're misgendered. It might be something that they experience a fair bit. It could be uncomfortable. Keep it brief, and make sure it's not about you. If you are corrected by someone, so somebody tells you, I use a pronoun he or they, try not to be defensive or rude. Say, okay, thanks for letting me know. Right? Not like, yeah, but you don't look this way. Yeah, but you didn't tell me. Yeah, this kind of a thing. Oh, okay, thanks for the information. If a person tells you that you've misgendered them, or someone else corrects you, you can thank them. Thanks for letting me know. Please don't try to make the person who you misgendered be the one responsible for comforting you, right? The role reversal. It's like now they're in charge of, trying to help make you feel better. If it was a small slip, just move on, and continue the conversation. Use a person's correct pronouns in front of them, but also when they're not there, right? If we're talking about correspondence, or we're talking about, in conversations, when they're not in the room, use that as well. And some of us might need more opportunities to try to practice, some of this terminology or pronouns or new expressions or that kind of thing, different ways of using language. Take those opportunities. And I'll also challenge people to correct others if you hear them misgendering as well. Okay, so it's important, I believe, that we really try to honor each other and identities in workplaces, in the larger society, in schools, and so on. Certainly, we want to set an example for working with younger folks and students. But we also just want to press upon people that there is a basic element here of civility and respect. And sometimes, especially with people who are more sort of black and white thinkers, we can turn to, there's often a code of conduct at the institution, and that's something that certainly can be pointed out as a part of basic decency, respect, and civility. So in the interest of time, I'm going to keep moving forward. Just a few tips for being inclusive in our teaching with the 2S LGBTQI community. And this acronym has gone through a lot of changes, right? So it might not be the one that is used at your institution or used with you regularly. This is the one it's used more regularly in Canada, but you might know it as LGBT, LGBTQ or plus, right? So there are variations that go on here. The 2S at the beginning stands for Two Spirit, which is an Indigenous representation. So what are some tips here? You can, in your groups, in your classrooms, introduce yourself with pronouns. You can add pronouns to email signatures like I've got here on Zoom, and letters, presentations, and encourage others to do the same. You can correct yourself if you make a mistake with a student's name. Again, we just went through this, and then keep it brief. You can use examples of all gender, sexuality, and relationships in your teachings and images. Make sure not to only use images of straight folks or, cis folks, right? Like, make sure that we've got all sorts of folks represented in the images and the stories that we tell. I really advise teachers and people that work in groups to never separate students by gender binaries. And that looks like, okay, everyone, we're going to line up and we're going to ask all the boys to go here and all the girls to go there. This is something that's been done for a long time. It's not something that's particularly helpful. I would much rather separate people on other random acts, right? Everybody that loves baseball, go there. Everybody loves football, go there. Right? Or everybody who likes plain pizza here and everybody who likes pepperoni there, right? Choose something that's not based in gender, so that people don't feel, entirely left out or excluded in some way based on their bodies or their identities. If we do not know somebody's pronouns, kind of like person first language, we usually drop to gender neutral pronouns, or we go to gender neutral pronouns. And the gender neutral pronouns are they, them, right? I know people love to debate that this is plural, and for some people will say it doesn't make sense. It's the best we've got, right? The they, them is what we've got. Now we actually have other, other kinds, they're called neo pronouns, and like ze, and so on, but they just sort of haven't caught on that well yet, which means that you might be using it alone, right? And not everybody's going to understand you. It might cause more confusion. So for now, we use they, them. These are the gender neutral pronouns that we have. If you don't know, right, it's much more respectful to go with they, them. Right. And if you hear someone else misgendering or being discriminatory in any way, I'm going to ask people to speak up and say something. Now, in the interest of time, I do want to shift over just to 2 slides around words that we no longer use in the field of disability. And then we're going to tie this all together and look at that intersectionality between disability and sexuality. and gender. So the first thing that I want to point out here is that there are disabilities that are visible and there are disabilities that are invisible. And we often, I believe as a society, we often sort of negate or forget, right? Those disabilities that are invisible. I mean, it's harder to, you know, it's easier, I should say, to forget them because they may not be as apparent. Okay. Um, so some disabilities that are visible include cerebral palsy, where folks may have amputation, Down syndrome, hard of hearing, or yeah, vision impaired, and so on. The not so apparent or invisible disabilities might be a large group of the folks that we work with. So certainly neurodiversity, so autism, Asperger's is still being used in some contexts. So it's pardon me, it's still on the slide, but a lot of people use autism level 1 through 3 now because that's the current DSM. Um, Non-apparent or invisible disabilities might include things like OCD, chronic illness, mood disorders, right? ADHD, dyslexia, chronic pain could be up there as well. Okay, so there are a number of, disabilities that may not be apparent to folks that they may be experiencing. Here's some language that we don't use anymore. So if you've got these going on in your regular vocabulary, I'm going to challenge you to bring awareness to it, and maybe it's time to, retire perhaps some of these words. Crazy, psychotic, mental, or insane. Right? So it's not, some of this is context dependent. If we talk about an experience being crazy or insane is different than a person being mental or insane. But most of these words have very negative kinds of connotations, right? And in a lot of ways, these terms are quite ableist. So some other terms, or expressions rather, are things like falling on deaf ears or turning a blind eye. This is one that I grew up with, right? And I know a lot of folks have grown up with similar kinds of expressions. But what we're actually meaning to say in these kinds of phrases is that I am not being heard, right? Or that the person ignored the problem. Okay, so we really want to focus on the meaning of what these sentences are saying and not so much on the disability, so falling on the deaf ears or turning a blind eye. This last one I wanted to bring in is one that we see used very commonly, which is I have OCD, I have OCD. So for anybody who really understands OCD, from a clinical perspective, understands that it's an anxiety disorder and it includes pervasive and mostly unwanted thoughts, right? That one feels as if they cannot get a good handle on and may impede on their function, and different parts of their life. So but it's often used today to describe being very orderly or, or clean or, hygienic in some way. It does minimize the seriousness of the diagnosis. And so it's important, rather than saying, I have OCD, even, and being sort of, cheeky, I think is how some people try to be with it. It's important to say things like I feel much better when things are just right. Right? Or everything I say in my home, everything has a place, everything has a home, right? I like, things in the closet in a certain way. I'm very organized, right? These kinds of things, rather than grabbing onto the terminology of the disability itself. So things to be aware of. And now, where we are going to end today is looking a little bit at that intersection between disability, right, and sexuality and gender variance. So I had said earlier that there's an increased rate that we see of these sort of worlds coming together, intersecting. Forgive me, there's a lot of information on this one slide, so I'm just going to go through it with all of you. To explain that some recent research has shown a correlation between neurodiverse individuals and individuals who have diverse sexuality and or gender identities. We've actually known this clinically for quite some time because we see in clinics a higher incidence of folks who are both neurodiverse and or gender variant. right? So the research is catching up now to help sort of define and attempt to explain why clinicians are seeing, what they've been seeing for a while now. So autistic self-identified males and females, right, that is identity first, are more likely to identify as either bisexual or homosexual than non-autistic peers. That's one of the points in the research. And I did send a few of these research articles to Sharona if anybody would, like to read more. And I'm happy to send more. We have all this research in PDF forms, but we just included some bullets for this slide. Individuals with autism are found to be around 3 times more likely to identify with a sexuality that is not heterosexual, homosexual, or bisexual than non-autistic individuals. Okay, so what are some of the other identities? Okay, it's a very good question. So the other identities likely will be pansexual and or asexual. Okay, so folks who are autistic are 3 times more likely also to identify as identities outside of straight, homosexual, or bisexual. And so I would say probably pan and or asexual. Also, individuals with ADHD are almost 7 times more likely to express gender variance as well. Okay, so a lot of people, consider ADHD as neurodiversity as well. We see a greater expression of gender variance here. Now, I want to be very, very clear. Neurodiversity does not cause gender variance, right? It's not if you, are neurodiverse that you are going to be gender variant, but there's a higher incidence of the two crossing over, and people are still trying to understand that a little bit more. Of individuals that present to gender variance clinics, up to 26% of them do have a diagnosis of ASD or autism spectrum disorder. So as you can see, that's not 95 or 100%, right? But 26% is a larger percentage than we would see in other percentage or in other populations of folks. Now, one thing that I do want to say and just leave you with is that many families and healthcare providers sometimes, I see this in my own practice as well, sometimes discount diverse gender expressions, right? So gender variance or, expressions of variance as being a phase, right? Or sometimes a special interest, especially when it co-occurs with ASD. Right, so we tend to have an assumption that somebody who has an autistic mind may, see gender or sexuality more as a special interest and perhaps a phase that one will go through. And there is no evidence to date that this is more of a special interest or a phase for someone with ASD than anyone else who may be gender variant. So I know we just shared a lot of information. I'm very proud that we did it in our allotted time because there was a lot to share here, but we did go over heteronormativity. We went over outdated examples in gender as well as sexual orientation, transitioning, what to do when we misgender, and then some inclusive tips and information around disability. So at this point, I think I'm going to stop share and we're going to come back to, well, here's one more slide just to say thank you. And then we'll come back to the, Sharona, what do you think that I'll take this off the screen so we can come back to the larger group to take questions?
Yes, that sounds good.
Fantastic. All right. Now that we've shown the thank you slide. Okay, everyone, now I can see your faces.
Yes. And I did want to mention, first of all, I want to thank you for a very educational, informative presentation, and we really appreciate that. So thank you so much. The second thing is that I have one question. Questions are not coming in, but I do want people to put it in the chat. If you do have to drop off at 3:30, that is fine. We're going to continue to record. But one of the questions that I'm just posing out there, just in case somebody doesn't want to ask it, you mentioned the word pan a lot, pan, 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 and not everyone on the call may know what pan means. So
Yeah.
can you explain what that is?
Sure, thank you. So the term bisexual is something that most folks understand or are more familiar with. Bisexual is a sexual attraction based in gender, right? So I'm attracted to both people who identify as male and female because I'm interested or attracted to the maleness and interested and attracted to the femaleness. Pansexual often gets confused with bi, but it's actually different. It's being interested in someone not because of their gender, but regardless of their gender. It's being sexually attracted to someone regardless of how they identify in terms of gender. And so it's really being attracted to somebody's aesthetic, somebody's energy. And so there are people who, lots of people identify as being pansexual. You might see them with somebody who identifies as male or female or non-binary or trans. Sometimes people who are in partnership with folks who are trans, either transitioning or people who are non-binary, partners may consider themselves pan because they're attracted to that partner regardless of how that person identifies, right? And there might be fluidity on that end. Does that make sense to me? I'm seeing head nods, so I'm pretty good at reading body language.
Yes.
So that's reassuring that we're all, head bobbing together. Okay, good.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. So someone asked, is there anything you're seeing within organizations to make it more, the workplace more inclusive? So current trends in the workplace.
But honestly, it's in services like this. It really is. So I know that sounds like that question was fed to me, but actually this is what I do most of these days, right? It's just talking to groups who want to know more, do better. It's the old Maya Angelou, when you know better, you do better, right? And things are shifting. So that's really the biggest trend I'm seeing, across most of the groups that I'm working with. Of course, those are the groups I'm working with. They invite me in, right? So maybe I'm only seeing one side of it, but that's what I'm seeing.
That's
If that
great. Thank
answers
you
it.
so
Yeah.
much. That's wonderful. So I'm going to respect everyone's time. We're actually at time right now. I want to thank everyone for joining us.
There's a
I
hand
hope,
up there with William. Sorry.
oh, is there? Sorry, is there a hand up? You can unmute. No?
Everything is fine. Somebody came into the room.
Okay.
Sorry
Okay.
about that.
All right. No problem. So thank you so much. And I appreciate it. And we'll be sending out the recording and the supporting materials. And really, thank you so much, Stephanie. This has been very, very helpful for all of us.
My
Thank you.
pleasure. And bravo to all of you for being here and listening and being a part of these changes. And these changes are just small changes, right? That we can all do to make others feel more welcome and included in our spaces. And that really makes a huge difference. So thank you to all of you for being here and listening. Thank you, Sharona, for organizing it. Thank you, CIP and DIBS for inviting us in. Be well,
Thank
everyone. Happy holidays.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Happy